I was unable to recover my video on chapter 6 in this textbook for our TESOL class, so I'm going to reconstitute it on the fly here. This chapter deals with assessment and setting up an ESL program. Obviously, you would use a screening test, the one that you use in the state of Nebraska and several other states, I believe Iowa and even I believe it's Washington State, Oregon, about 8 other states, use the ELPA 21, and there's a screening test. It's administered by computer over the internet, so it's very useful. It took a number of years to put this together. We used to use all kinds of little paper tests to give us some idea, and it was a real guessing game. The interesting thing about assessment and placement is that it's fairly easy to know when you have a student who is a total newcomer, who has no idea about the language and is completely lost. And then it's fairly easy to know if you have a student that's almost perfect or very, very good and is almost ready to go into regular classes. So the beginning or newcomer class, I want to mention newcomer is usually a term used for a temporary class to get students acclimated to the school. So a newcomer class is not a permanent class. It's more of a 1-month introduction. It's more cultural than it is linguistic. And then you go to beginning class. So you have to get students acclimated. It's essentially orientation. So beginning and the end are not too hard to figure out. The stuff in between is much more complicated. For example, when you have a student that is very advanced in speaking, but is very weak in reading and writing. So they have the BICS, but not the CALPS. And we know from your readings, the CALPS take several years, it may take 8 years, it may take 5, 6 years. Whereas, the best way to imagine this, think about yourself as an English language person. You speak English. If you went to France, you would be pretty much lost. You'd need a little newcomer to get you orientated so you knew some of the rules, cultural rules, so that it would ease you and you would put you in a position where people would respect you. You didn't violate certain mannerisms or customs. You would dress properly. But if you think about if you even spoke French fairly well, and by the way, a lot of people spoken Japanese and they're fairly fluent in it. But then when they get to written Japanese, it's a whole different ballgame. It's very, very difficult. So it depends on, the difference between your background and language. If you have a totally different alphabet, a pictograph kind of based language, or even kanji, which is basically an anglicized using our vocabulary to write out words in Japanese. If you know the spoken language but don't know the written, you were kind of like that student who's got street English but can't write an essay, can't read very much, who's basically illiterate in terms of, and still therefore way behind academically. So you're going to have those extremes, and those are tough. I've rarely seen the reverse. I've seen people that write pretty well but didn't speak much English, and that's a result of being from a background where they studied English intensely and they really understood how to write in English and even how to read some in English, but they didn't have much practice in pronunciation, conversation. They were totally lost when people had talked to them. That's kind of a rare circumstance. That's like studying English in a very academic way from the very beginning. You don't really see that. So you got the language levels in there. As I mentioned, the extremes are not difficult to determine. What is difficult is going from the second and third stage, those two middle stages or three middle stages, depending on how you set your program. And you have to look at the different skills. I mean, you got reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And listening and speaking are BICs, and reading and writing are CALPs. And you may have some students advanced in one and way behind in the other. And so you have to adjust to those. You can't package them and say all four skills are at the emerging level or the developing level, whatever term you use, average or medium or you'll have maybe 5 different categories. But if you're the only teacher in the school, you're probably going to have only 3 categories maximum, because that's all you can handle. You only can divide your time up in a certain way. So the assessment by tests is a good way to get you started. But one of the things you have to look at with your ESL approach is that you're going to have students that through their personality, their quickness, their intuition, their ability to grasp things. And when I say personality, I mean kind of assertive, or at least very, very positive, very assertive, very, very aggressive in getting involved. And some cultures are less aggressive than others by our own judgment or definition. But I found that many times women, females, are very quick to pick up a language, and some males are quick to pick up a language, but it depends on their culture and their background. And another thing is, how well do they make friends with native speakers? If they have a lot of friends that are native speakers, they're going to get so much input that certainly their BICs will improve. And that's why you have to look just outside of look beyond just your classroom and what reader level they're on. The academic is more in your area. Conversationals where they can really improve quickly on their own outside of the classroom, because in classrooms we don't teach that much. If all the English all of us knew in our own language is what we learned in the classroom, we wouldn't be very articulate. The fact is that we spend the vast majority of our time getting input from outside of school, and that's where language occurs. We talk about 2 types of assessments, and these are really simple to keep separate. Summative evaluations, when you take that end of semester test and it says you're at this certain level, this is how much you've learned. You don't give summative tests every week. It's more long range. And in a lot of ways, for purposes of teaching, summative tests are not particularly useful. What you want are formative evaluations or formative tests. That means you constantly are observing, maybe taking notes. I've seen very effective ways teachers take little Post-its and they notice things about their students and they write it up and they just put in a little notebook about that student. And so they don't, it's not a test, but it's noticing that, oh, suddenly they're using the progressive tense correctly, or their vocabulary, their ability to respond to questions is dramatically improved. And so you just note these things. It's not very scientific, but it's real. You know what it's like? It's like being a person who is making statues, a sculptor, and suddenly things are starting to take shape, and you see, oh, the student was able to negotiate a situation. Maybe they wanted to buy their lunch or get their lunch ticket, or maybe they wanted to make a deal with somebody to buy a car, or were playing a game in the classroom. And you notice they were really articulate. They were able to think through what they wanted and how they were going to get it. So that can be very interesting for students. Assessments have to be valid. That's why I really like formative, because how students perform in the class is, as long as they're doing exercises that parallel a genuine conversation or a genuine language assignment, or a reading assignment, then those are quality assessments, and they're called authentic. Authentic. Now, fill in the blank. You know, a lot of tests that we give, fill in the blank. The worst ones are word search. That just looking for words. That's kind of a game. That's not really, you know, they recognize a word and they can spell it fine, great. But more complex tests, everything from essay writing all the way down to asking for directions or being able to explain how to do something, how to make pancakes, and they can go through and explain it orally, or they can write down all the steps, or how to wax a car, how to repair a broken radiator in some detail. Students that are really interested and have a high interest in whatever you're talking about will master the language much better. The example I can draw from is a young man from Japan whose English was really poor. But amazingly, the more I talked with him, and he, by the way, he was also not typical of a lot of Japanese young men. He did not stick with a group. He was always doing things on his own, which is unusual because follow the leader is pretty common in some cultures, and particularly with Japanese international students at this school I was at. And most of the students were always in a group, and kind of, you could tell they always kind of followed one or two people. But this one guy, and I think his name was Montabu or Montaputu or something, he was into fly fishing, and nobody else knew anything about it. He studied fly fishing. He studied everything about fishing for trout and streams. He would pay money to fishermen to take him on a trip and take him out to go fly fishing. He was very serious. He'd hire a guide. So turned out that was going to be his profession. He was going to be a professional fisherman. And after he left, I think he went back to Japan, and his job was to work for a company that was like a tourist company, only they took you, some of them took people hunting, like I guess shooting bears or something. Others would take their guys up in the mountains, and with the Japanese businessmen, fly fishing was a great delight. And so, because he was obviously Japanese and fluent in Japanese and very knowledgeable about fly fishing, in fact, he knew all the terms in English of fly fishing, Japanese and English. He had mastered all the vocabulary. He knew everything connected with it. So he had a very specific vocabulary, but within that vocabulary, he was an expert. He was an expert on fly fishing, period. And so I would say that, you know, giving him a test, and they talk about fill in the blank tests and things, and I've just kind of made fun of the word search, is that you want to have assessments that are real. For instance, if I had that young man in a class and I wanted to test his performance in English, I wouldn't ask him to write about literature. I wouldn't ask him to write about how to balance an accounting sheet or you know, directions to Dallas, you know, or something. I would ask him to set up and prepare a program for a fly fishing tour for some businessmen, different countries. Believe it or not, he was perfect. And so there's a lot to be said, having a great interest in something and expanding from, because his English was pretty rough. But then as I got to know him, I was amazed with his brilliance and intelligence and his knowledge of American fishing history and how to fish and how to do those flies, you know, tie the bait or the flies, however they call that in fishing. I didn't know anything about it. He had cases of this stuff and different hooks and everything. Very impressive fellow. Okay. So you look at performance tests, and that's what I mentioned with him. He could perform. And of course, in school, you have more general expectations. I mean, obviously, if you're in a speech class, you want to give a speech about some topic. You want it to be clear and pronunciation. You know, obviously, the fellow I described, he he wouldn't necessarily get A's in everything, but I'm sure he's a successful businessman now, doing exactly what he wanted to do. It was amazing. Can never be underestimated. Things here about the performance tasks they talk about, is it appropriate? Talks about dressing properly, being able to answer questions, language, mastery, speak grammatically, was he understand, not that he had an accent. You never really hold accents against people. You really got to be careful of that, because you will retain an accent. If you're a Southerner like Jeff Foxworthy, you're going to have that accent. Some accents are very highly prized, that people like them. For instance, Scottish accent. It's very distinct, or Australian accent. I used to know Americans that, particularly girls, that they'd meet an Australian guy and they'd speak Australian. They just fall in love with the way they talked. Or Scots, which wasn't quite as attractive, I guess, or sexy, but it was interesting. I happen to love French accents or English accents, depending on what part of England. If it's an educated accent, I like it. So accents should not be ruled out or be considered a defect, because they can't always be you can't always erase them, and you may not want to. That's part of your personality too. They also talk in here about classes, types of classes, pullouts, and I've already given you that sheet on that. The sheltered workshop, which is really the huge and most common one, and for those of you, I just want to reiterate this, the sheltered workshop that we used in Lex, we had a problem when we first started ESL, when they did in Lexington. And that issue was that they had a lot of students studying English, but if they took 2 years to get their English up to a certain level before they took their regular classes, they might be too old to go to school, because I think 21 is the age limit. So if they had a student come in at 16 and they kept him in regular ESL classes and he didn't earn any credits, then by the time he was 18, he had to start his high school then. He couldn't finish it in time. The other issue is, the solution to that was to have sheltered workshops. So there were ESL teachers who would teach math. There were ESL teachers who would teach social studies. Now, they weren't necessarily certified in social studies. They should have been, but the state gives you some flexibility. So we'd have ESL teachers that were reading teachers, but they might teach English. They weren't high school English teachers. And some of them taught elementary. I mean, they were kind of used in a very flexible way. But they were given credit for earning English credits. So while they're learning English, they're studying English and earning credits, like lit, like sophomore. So they try to give them some literature to read and improve their writing. But the idea was they were also taking math, and they would also take PE. And those classes, if you don't know this, a lot of you know this, I'm not telling anything, that people would know that you would take your language arts, but then you would also take art and PE and music. And those were kind of considered not so heavily dependent on language, because music performance, if they sang in the choir, or if they ran track, or they participated in sports, they were earning credits. And they were earning regular credits in PE. But then they would try to help the PE teacher to prepare, so students would have maybe a part-time, or the sheets would be translated if they read their own language, Spanish. But they tried to accommodate them any way they could, so that when they would finish school, they would have a chance to be close to, or having graduated, they would be able to go to whatever they needed to go to. Some students would go ahead and study. Some would go to work immediately, like other students. you wanted to put them in the best position to be able to earn a living and to have opportunities and choices in their life. And so that's why we had sheltered classes. So there was a regular biology, and then there was ESL biology. There also sometimes would be a kind of remedial class for math, and that would have a combination of EL students plus the students who weren't very strong in math. So schools tried to accommodate. They tried to help the students. And so the goal of our assessments is to find the best way to get them in a position to take control of their life. Okay, I don't think assessments per se rule the roost. Obviously, you want to get them to they can perform and pass the ESL and get out of the ESL program, but try to find as many ways as you can push. My friend used to say, push the envelope. That's a term, you know. In other words, to push to try to get them through as much as possible so they'd have an opportunity. As they got older, they would learn more English and it'd be successful. Okay, well, there's my discussion over chapter 6. And I don't know what happened to that. It never did take. So I'm going to put this in there. How you like my shirt? Guy down at Hayes sent it to me. I like coffee and maybe 3 people. And you know I'm a very nice person, so that can't be true. But sometimes I only like 3 people. Sometimes not even that. So, okay, thank you.